Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good afternoon to everyone. First of all, I would like to thank my colleagues at SC for a job well done for once again organizing the annual SC by SC event. In this 8th edition, I, Haniza, from the Islamic Capital Market Development SC, am very excited to moderate another exciting conversation with a panel lineup rich with experience and insight. But first, before I begin, I would like to share with those dialed in or connected. There has been a slight change in the line of panelists. It is rather unfortunate, but we'll have to say a miss to Madam Raja from the IFC, as there was a last minute conflicting schedule, and therefore apologies for that change. However, we have here a panel lineup. We're still very rich with experience and much to share on their journeys. But before we get into that, maybe I'll just give a slight preamble for a bit of a warm-up. I think from the various panel sessions in both past and present, SC by SC, we continue to see Islamic markets have integrated fintech, showing tremendous growth opportunities. And today, the broad topic entitled Building Blocks of a World-Class Islamic Fintech Hub is very timely, especially following the release of the Capital Market Master Plan 3 for Malaysia last month, where, as said by the Chairman of Securities Commission Malaysia this morning, technology is one of the main thrusts. Digital capabilities will be magnified to facilitate fundraising for companies of all sizes, at the same time encouraging innovation and inclusion, a word we've come to hear a lot more in this last 18 to 20 months post-pandemic, or in the pandemic or endemic that we are in right now. We're also seeing how in this situation, past the health crisis that we saw, market-based financing platforms within the capital market continued to meet and support the smaller companies, the segment most affected, to provide alternatives to the traditional options they usually go to and meet funding gaps, especially. As businesses continue to be impacted, be it demand, supply, it became that going digital was non-negotiable. And we know that, and we hear that more now. So while serving underserved and democratizing solutions, Islamic fintech also presents deep opportunities in a diverse range of verticals, solutions, products, services. I think the way of life basically has transformed, arising from the pandemic, from doing charity to buying groceries to making an investment choice. Islamic fintech is well positioned and well embodied to leverage social finance and solutions that embodies the sustainable development goals, Maqasid al-Sharia. And this year, I think, just to share with everyone, SC Malaysia launched FICRA. This is the first regulator-led fintech accelerator program. Is to identify and scale innovative startups. We have solutions focusing on enhancing Islamic capital market value proposition. We're looking at new offerings, greater accessibility to capital, greater inclusivity, and greater integration with social finance. So to start the conversation today with the two gentlemen, building, growing, nurturing Islamic finance digital capabilities is essential for the growth of Sharia financing and investing. So what are the building blocks essential for us to build a world-class Islamic fintech hub? We have about 45 to 50 minutes or so. I think that's what it's on the schedule, but I think we'll go with the time and we'll see how this conversation goes. I'm just going to introduce both gentlemen briefly. We have with us today Abdul Hasid Basit, co-founder and principal of Ellipsis and also chairman of Yielders, a crowdfunding property investment platform and the first regulated Islamic fintech in the UK. We also have with us Haris Irfan, chairman of the UK Islamic Fintech Panel and CFO of Gateway Global. He co-founded the UK Islamic Fintech panel to boost London's status as a center for Islamic finance industry. That chapter and that experience, we definitely want to hear a lot more, Haris. So with that, I want to start the ball rolling by inviting Haris maybe first to share your views and journey pertaining to that topic today. And I think my first question as we start this conversation is, what do you see as key components for the build of this world-class Islamic fintech hub aspiration? And what would be the underpinning or underlying growth factors that has made us reach where we are now? For a start, over to you, Hasib.
Yeah, so would you like me to start or Abdul to start?
I'm good, actually. I started off with Hasib, but Haris, you took over.
No, please do. In that case, please do. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum and bismillah, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to the panel. Yes, I think this is a very important topic. So one of the areas of my background that you didn't mention was that previous to what I do now, I was a co-founder and CFO of Innovate Finance, which is the UK's FinTech Association. So I had lots of experience in the early days of FinTech in what it takes to build a FinTech ecosystem. The slight nuance to what we're discussing today was that was a conventional fintech ecosystem, but the building blocks are essentially the same. The three major ones that we tend to focus on are capital, talent, and regulation. The UK has a very unique position in that the FCA was given a competition mandate by policymakers when it was reformed from the FSA after the financial crisis. And I believe it still remains as the only regulator to have an active competition mandate. But what that did was that spurred a lot of introspection into the sector and looking at areas where competition could be boosted. And as a derivative of that, an innovation hub was set up, which allowed new ideas to come to the fore and for the regulator to actively assess how those ideas could come to market and be regulated. That drove the first wave of innovation in the UK. And since then, lots of regulators have followed suit. In the Global Islamic FinTech report, which we developed in a few years ago, and the last edition came out in March this year, we looked at a lot of the OIC hubs, specifically around what it takes to be conducive to being an Islamic FinTech hub. We looked at 8 areas: regulation, Sharia compliance, access for international fintechs, proximity to customers, talent, capital, banks' participation in fintech, and the overall Islamic finance market share as a whole for the finance sector. And we asked each of the hubs to measure themselves on it, and the results were varied. Unsurprisingly, Malaysia came out on top. Malaysia always tends to come out on top because there is really a coordinated effort from the top down in Malaysia to address these issues. What we see is, as you've mentioned, regulators getting involved in driving fintech forward. There is a strong Islamic finance market generally in the jurisdiction, and there is a talent base that exists for both Islamic finance and technology. Thereafter, then each hub has to look at some of the levers it can pull to really leapfrog itself to the fore. Some of those really are down to policymakers. It's things like enabling capital. So some of the examples that we're seeing right now is in the Middle East specifically, where there isn't a scarcity of capital, but historically there's been a scarcity of capital for small and medium enterprises. We're now seeing government-backed fund of funds looking at seeding venture capital firms to really help address that gap. One of the other things that really comes across in our study is that capital really is a key driver, and for many reasons. Firstly, when we talk about enablers, most of the Islamic fintech CEOs that we speak to always talk about capital as being the real enabler. Capital really allows them to do everything they need to do, even if there's a talent shortage, even if there isn't really a market for what they're building. The capital goes a long way in addressing some of the other pain points. It really gives them the time allowed or they need to develop their product and take it to market and refine it. When we look at challenges, again, capital comes to the fore because Islamic fintechs have a real challenge in accessing capital. And so really it's kind of this double-edged sword, capital. It's it's a real enabler, but it's also possibly the most scarce thing for Islamic fintechs as well. And then all of this we have to look at within the context of fintech generally. So very few ecosystems are really focused purely on Islamic fintech. So it's Islamic fintech within the wider fintech ecosystem. And so a lot of these challenges are actually not unique to Islamic fintech. The areas that are really unique to Islamic fintech are things like access to Sharia scholars and how robust Sharia frameworks are within the jurisdiction, and actually consumer education. So how well does the consumer actually understand Islamic finance and Islamic finance products? I think as an opener, I'll leave it there in terms of the key areas that need to be addressed for an Islamic fintech ecosystem, and pass over to Harris.
Abdullah, I would add one more thing to your list there, which is the connection with the consumers, which is also a function of consumer education as well. I think that, and certainly in the UK, Malaysia is quite a different example, actually. Malaysia, I find that the banks are generally run by, the Islamic banks are run by individuals who themselves are users of the services, which I think is really, really key to a successful Islamic bank. In the UK, unfortunately, senior management of the Islamic banks in the UK are not necessarily users of those services themselves. And there is a very, very manifest disconnect between the institution that serves people and the people themselves. So the banks are not representative of the people that they serve. And what we're seeing in the UK market is that a lot of Islamic fintech companies have been founded by individuals who weren't able to get what they wanted from the banks. And they said to themselves, well, look, I have the skill set to do this. So I'm going to create my own company, and I'm going to assemble the right kind of people, and I'm going to raise the capital, and I'm going to give myself the product that I've been looking for from the banks, which they weren't able to deliver to me. So I think that connection with the consumers is really, really important. And I think the Islamic fintech companies are able to deliver that, partly because they're much, much smaller, they're early stage, they're startup, and you tend to have your own culture at that early stage. And as an organization becomes bigger and bigger, it's possible that you lose that culture. It becomes more sort of corporatized, if that's a word. And that's a natural progression. But I think that it's that connection with the consumers and that representation, that the fact that the services are being supplied by people who look and think and act and talk like the people who buy the product, I think that's super important, because without that, you don't have, there's a credibility gap, there's a trust gap. And I think that's what's happened in the UK market. And at the moment, I don't think the Islamic banks have worked it out. I think they're starting to work it out. They've had cumulative losses over the last 15 years where the banking industry generally has been profitable. But they still haven't got around to pinpointing the exact type of person that they need to connect with the consumer. And that for them is still a struggle. But the fintech firms, they've got it sorted from day one.
Harris, just a follow-on question on that. I mean, it's interesting you'd say that stakeholders are not representative of what it should be, and therefore you have a credibility gap. What can be done for that? Although in Malaysia, yeah, you're right, the stakeholders or the bank owners themselves use it, but again, it's about that representation and being able to understand what's required from the consumers. So I mean, it's not having just skin in the game commercially, but actually having to understand the pain points. And therefore, if you're going to try and propagate this segment as something that can enable the consumers, the value chain, and going back a little bit to what Hasib was talking about, how access to capital is a challenge. How do we make this circle work better for us? Because I agree with both of you gentlemen that access to capital, and I think the ability to manifest something that is in the spirit of it is more than just in the spirit of it. But we've heard this a couple of times over the years already. I mean, a couple of times is an understatement, obviously. I mean, we know these are common pain points for a lot of fintech startups, especially for the Islamic fintech. And taking on another comment that I think it was Hasib who said that Islamic fintech is not a dedicated ecosystem. It is within a larger pool of fintechs that maybe by default conventional, they might have easier access to the capital, something we need to understand better. So I'm hoping that through this conversation, we can try and ideate. Maybe I know it's a tall order, ideating in a panel session. How does one find a solution to this concern? Is it synergies through partnership? Is it getting the public in? I mean, getting the public sector in, the regulators playing a role.
Yeah.
How can regulators then play a bigger role in this? Because obviously in an ecosystem, that's a strong building block. We help to enable, we help to facilitate. So we can come up with a lot of different frameworks, a lot of nudges, guidance. But how does that gain traction? Because it's a vicious circle, right? We all know it's demand, supply, and getting skin in the game. Your thoughts on this, Harris?
Yeah, about a year and a half ago, the UK regulator, the FCA, appointed a new CEO. And when he was being interviewed by the Common Select Committee, which is the parliamentary committee, he very publicly said that the FCA would take a more inclusive approach. And they were prepared, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, so forgive me if I get this slightly wrong, but essentially he said that the FCA may block appointments where they see that not enough diversity has been included into the boards of financial services institutions. And I thought that was a real refreshing, change for the FCA, which is, generally being considered quite a stuffy organization. I wrote to the FCA last year following this announcement and suggested that and set out the stats, the numbers for the Islamic banking industry, and said that as much as we like to praise the UK Islamic finance industry, and it has done well as a Western hub for Islamic finance, it's a great, robust legislative environment. It's got great access to talent, to technology. It's a world financial center. But as much as we've got, great ancillary services and infrastructure on our doorstep, I think we overplay the fact that we are, so great at Islamic finance, because our numbers are telling us a different story. The profitability of our Islamic banks, for example. And today, the sector generally, I think, is a little bit stagnated. And what I suggested was, if you want to improve that, then let's take a much closer look at Islamic fintech. There's two conversations that took place. One is that both Abdul and I suggested that there should be a boost for the Islamic fintech system. And the other conversation was that I spoke to the FCA directly and said that you should consider introducing a policy for Islamic banks in the UK that ensure that those banks are more representative of the people they serve. So, for example, the policy may say that for every senior management role, we must interview one woman, one person of color, and one Muslim if it's an Islamic bank. Because if you don't have Muslims in senior management, then how do they connect with the customer base? How do you know what they're thinking? If they haven't been in their shoes, then you don't know what products and what services and what culture and what values they have. And I think that's a real failing at the moment. So actually that letter disappeared into a black hole. And despite me following up on repeated occasions, I haven't heard anything. But that's very similar to the Rooney Rule in the United States. The Rooney Rule was something that was done by the NFL, the National Football League, I think about, if I'm not wrong, 10, 15 years ago. And that rule was that for every senior management role with a football club within a franchise, they needed to interview one person of color. That's all. Not hire, not a quota system, just an interview. And following that, I think the industry ended up having about 16 or 17 new hires at senior management level who are not white. I think that's a very commendable rule to implement. It's a policy rule that doesn't have a quota system. It doesn't force them to hire, but it forces them to consider somebody they might not have considered before, because there's still this, attitude within the financial services industry that, a leader has to look and talk and act like a certain way. And that isn't necessarily my definition of a leader. It may not be your definition of a leader. And we end up getting leaders who don't look anything like us, who don't talk like us, who don't act like us, who don't think like us. And as a result, how do they know what kind of products I want? How do they know what my lifestyle is? How do they know what my daily life is? How do they know that I go to the mosque on a Friday, or that I pray 5 times a day, or I give in Ramadan, or, they don't know this stuff, right? So I think that's a really crucial thing. And as I say, one of the ways we can do that is speak directly to the regulator and say, let's have a policy change. Let's start doing these things so that we're more representative. Abdul, over to you.
Yeah, I think I think I could wholeheartedly agree with that as the sort of problem statement for the UK Islamic fintech sector, which has been very much in the lead, as it were, from a global perspective in developing Islamic fintechs. I think looking more globally, I think the point that you were raising earlier about, or following on from my earlier point about capital. Why is there this gap? And I think that gap exists because there is a failing within the Islamic finance sector generally. We haven't developed Islamic capital markets to the extent that conventional capital markets are developed. We don't have large pension funds that seed private capital back into the ecosystem to allow private equity and venture capital to exist. These are things that we are just catching up on. The Muslim world is not short of capital. It's just we haven't built those mechanisms. We're starting to. The Middle East is very much taking the lead on this now, and that really is a key way to help solve some of these capital challenges. Added to that, there's other areas. There's you mentioned small and medium enterprises. Small and medium enterprises are some of the most underrepresented organizations financially, globally, conventional and Islamic, and one of the things that we always notice is that fintechs that come to the fore that are looking to solve SME financing, whether it be through lending or some other mechanism, in places like the UK, we have institutions like the British Business Bank that will seed liquidity into these organizations. We don't have anything equivalent in the Islamic world. And any organization that is trying to do that really struggles because, again, those mechanisms don't exist. Now, if the questions or the problem statement is what can policymakers, regulators do to solve this, I think they need to be able to enable those organizations to exist. There needs to be a central pool of capital that can help to allocate to an industry that can help solve some of these challenges. So they almost, again, acting as that sort of fund-to-fund level from the government down. Harry, sorry, you wanted to interject there on something.
I think a good example of that is Islamic Development Bank. So, of course, the IDB works across its member nations, and the UK is, of course, not a member nation. It's not OIC, and yet the UK has the largest number of Islamic fintech firms. Obviously, by volume, someone like Malaysia is bigger, but just in terms of number of firms, the UK is quite a thriving market, and access to capital for those firms is very limited because, as we know, and as Abdullah has been saying, the Islamic institutions are not necessarily the type of institutions that invest on a VC basis, on a venture capital basis. They tend to look at tangible, simple assets like real estate. So it's a very new area for them. And secondly, your typical Silicon Valley type investor is not familiar with the Islamic economy, with the halal economy, with Islamic fintech, for example. So there is this funding gap. So that means that we're in this situation where these companies have very limited access to capital, and this is a real opportunity for them. If the Islamic Development Bank is, I don't know how this would happen, but if they're able to look at their policy and say, we may be interested, we may be willing to look outside of OIC, where we see an opportunity to develop fintech firms in a thriving location like London, for example, with access to technology and capital and talent and so on. And work with those companies, fund them so that they may expand globally into OIC nations. I think that's a potential strategy that the IDB could deploy.
Oh, I totally agree. I mean, that's a huge potential for sure if IDB took a stance in that manner. But obviously, to get to that very significant shift in the way they approach how they fund, that's a separate conversation altogether. I'm sure Haris, you will agree with me on that. Yeah. But I think both of you raised some pertinent points like diversity, governance, of the stakeholders, and that will then enable the growth. But I also picked up something you said. Notwithstanding all that, the UK jurisdiction has I mean, it's a success story for in terms of numbers, Islamic fintech companies that set up the birth of many new names there. You know, I would like if you could share maybe, was the profile of this fintech more banking services centric, or was it capital market? That's my first question. The second is, notwithstanding all the other pain points that you talked about, access to capital and having skin in the game, or that representation more fairly exhibited, how did you get to where you are today? I mean, it's quite impressive, you know, in terms of the development that's taken place over that period of time. I'm sure a lot of us would like to know what created that, and no doubt, like you said, some of them are, whether it's banks or even the startups, are not facing profitable situations. What's your view on that, Harris?
Yeah.
Shall I have
please
a go
do.
at the first part of the question, and you can have a go at the second part. How did we get to where we are today? So just regarding the profile of the fintechs, the UK, I think, has seems to have a bias towards challenger banking and wealth management and robo advisory, that kind of thing. So a lot of the UK Islamic fintech companies tend to be there are good examples like Kestrel, for example, that creates a wealth management dashboard on a mobile app. And that seems to be a very, I don't want to say very common, but that seems to be the most significant growth area in the UK. I think partly because the UK has obviously a strong tradition of banking generally, and the Islamic banks, were set up here 15 years ago. The investment banks exported a lot of talent from London to other locations like DIFC, for example, in the early 2000s. So there's that history there, and that may explain why digital challenger banking has seemed to be so popular here. I think that's that has its own challenges as well, because one doesn't want to saturate the market with early stage startups purporting to be banks. These are not banks in the slightest. These are very, very long way from being banks, and one doesn't want to spoil the market. So that's the sort of profile of the kind of companies that we have. There are other fintech firms, and there are other halal economy firms which are not financial related, and the UK seems to have a wide spectrum of this. But as I say, it's challenger banking that seems to be the most interesting. So regarding how did we get to where we are, Abdullah, I think I'll let you handle
Yeah,
it.
I think again, to put a bit of a frame on what Haris is saying, the fintech firms, the Islamic fintech firms that have thrived have really been areas of underservice. So where retail consumers are not being served in the UK, and most of the early development was in areas of low regulatory friction, peer-to-peer crowdfunding, where regulations were just emerging. The sort of enabler for that was, again, that competition mandate, which was a freedom to operate. So if there are firms starting in an unregulated area, one of the best things regulators can do is let them operate even with limited scope, so that they can prove what they're doing, prove it works, prove it's safe for the consumer before they scale it. Having said that, the UK, yes, we do have the highest volume of fintechs anywhere in the world, Islamic fintechs in the world. Others are catching up very fast. That won't be the case for much longer. And the reason that won't be the case for much longer is, other than the points we've mentioned, I do think there is a ceiling within the UK. And that ceiling is really because the Islamic finance sector has not developed beyond what it has. So our fintechs then start to look elsewhere, especially if they're in the B2B space. We have a perfect example of one that Haris and I are really familiar with, Islamic Markets, who started here in the UK, are a B2B fintech, and moved their headquarters to Malaysia because that's where they believe the scale and growth is going to come from. I don't think anyone can fault them on their decision. I think they've done exactly the right thing for their business. But that's a huge miss for the UK, that we've taken such a dynamic fintech and not been able to provide it what it needs, or the air it needs to grow here in the UK. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. A lot of the fintechs that I'm involved with, other than the capital point, actually, some of the other challenges that exist in the UK are, available market. The Islamic banks haven't developed an available market for Islamic finance here beyond the sort of the high net worth audience. So certainly not at the retail audience, which is why you see things like challenger banking emerging. I think, going back to your earlier point about what can regulators do to enable this, I think one of the real things that regulators can do is look at their jurisdiction and look at the areas of underservice. So, for example, COVID's a real turning point in that we are getting to the point where things we took for granted, like handling cash, has become difficult. So, look at how digitally enabled your financial services are across the board, and start to allow innovation in areas that you think there is underservice, and certainly areas that Islamic banks are not going to address. So, making digital banking available in some jurisdictions are much better than others at this. But if there is a financial inclusion problem, certainly digital banking is the way to go to help solve some of that. Look at your payments infrastructure. If you have mainly a cash-based society, we have high mobile penetration in the Muslim world and low financial access. There's absolutely no reason that should exist. A lot of what regulators can do is encourage those types of solutions to exist, and thereafter look at areas within the retail banking space that are not being served. So, for example, if there's not enough investment options, look at areas like crowdfunding, peer-to-peer, robo-advisory. We talked about SME financing. SME financing, I think, globally across OIC countries is an issue. And Harris and I are big believers that there is really an opportunity for a global player within the SME financing space within the Islamic world.
That's a nice segue. It's actually into my next question to both of you. Halal economy. A lot of the small, medium enterprises in most jurisdictions in the halal economy is from that category. I think the pandemic taught and brought out a lot of innovation, I think to a lot of degree, because of the need to just, how do I deal with disruption? How do I deal with businesses that stopped, lives have changed, and therefore it was pleasant to see the push into, well, you can't do anything else but ideate and innovate. Where do you see that vis-a-vis UK? And also maybe your take on the halal economy globally. Because for Malaysia, this is an area we are focusing on. SC came out, and this is tied to another question, which I'll take on later. This is tied on to how do you bring the small, medium MSMEs into the space of market-based funding options.
All right, let me kick off on this one. The digital halal economy is in some ways has an even greater challenge than Islamic fintech to raise capital. Often smaller, often earlier stage. They look at areas like halal fashion, Islamic education, halal media, all of these sort of areas which have less, let's say, they're not as celebrated or as glamorous as fintech right now. So, they naturally have a greater struggle to get people interested, to get investors interested in them. And they tend to be in an earlier stage. I'm involved as a co-owner of an Islamic education app and website called Ilmspired. It's an Islamic studies app for 5 to 11-year-olds. And it is, in some ways, much more challenging than starting up an Islamic fintech firm. Because at least with an Islamic fintech firm, one knows, especially if one works in this industry, one knows where to go to find specialists in product structuring or, financial marketing or regulatory and compliance work or legal work and so on. It's not quite so straightforward in, an ed tech company. So that has been quite a struggle, and to raise funding for that has required us to either convince conventional VCs that there is such a thing as the Muslim demographic and there's a huge demand for halal services, or to convince Islamic institutional investors that, the halal digital economy is coming, and it is in some senses more speculative than buying real estate, but it is an area you need to look at more closely. There are a very limited number of funds from Islamic institutions that invest directly into very early stage halal economy companies, and that I think is the single biggest challenge for those small companies.
Yeah, I think I'll add to that. So I'm certainly not an expert on the halal economy generally. Our partners with the report, Dinar Standard, produce the global Islamic economy report every year, and I believe the next one is due out any time now. I mean, if you look at the size of the market, they're talking about a $2.2 trillion market, which is halal economy outside of finance. Finance itself is, that's sizable again. And it's rather baffling to me that we've got a market of that size, yet we don't have much investor interest in that market. Most of the investment that I see going into the halal economy is going into bricks and mortar businesses, and most of the investment going into tech businesses is really at the fledgling early stage, coming from angel investors who are themselves tech entrepreneurs and or somehow involved in tech, really believing in this space. What we haven't seen is really that top-down investment approach or the mass market investment approach into halal economy. That I think is a real miss. Again, it's encouraging when we see governments and sovereign wealth funds investing in tech globally. I think that's, they're, in my opinion, they are slightly late to the game. They should have been doing this years ago, but trying to diversify their economies away from, things like oil and gas. But they've now started to do that and now funding some of the biggest startups in the world. But nobody has yet said, here's an allocation of capital for developing the Islamic economy. I think the question really for policymakers is, how much do you value the Islamic economy? Those of us in it are believers in it. Those of us that consume those products are believers in it. But there has to be the political will to actually produce more of a halal economy in your jurisdiction and support it. And without that, we're always going to be at the same level, the same growth rate, and it's not really going to dominate in those jurisdictions. So that, I wholeheartedly agree with Harris that for Islamic economy startups, outside of Islamic fintech, it's even harder to raise capital. We see it all the time.
I think the reason why I did ask both of you on the halal economy is it was also actually trying to come back to the topic today, the building blocks of a world-class Islamic fintech hub. I mean, maybe this is a question I should have asked both of you earlier. How would you define a world-class Islamic fintech hub? What makes it a world-class hub? Obviously, the differentiating factor for Islamic finance as Islamic fintech hub would be the areas which are very much closer to Islam. The likes of halal economy, the social finance, the philanthropic side of it. And these are elements that will make it the differentiating factor, and maybe try and get in not too deep into the conversation of whether you Islamize or conventional product, or you go the other way. I think this is always a conversation that most of us have had at some time or other. So I think that's why I'm trying to relate. If you were to build a world-class Islamic fintech hub, are there specific areas that you build it on? Do you focus on it, or do you make it generic? Would love to hear your definitions of that, because only then can we decide or determine what makes up the building blocks, right? I mean, the basic design architecture of a hub is quite easy to pen down on a paper. What makes it a world-class Islamic fintech hub is the question today, and I'm giving it to both of you.
Can I have a first go at that, Abdul? I
Sure.
mean, Abdul, you've already mentioned from your Innovate Finance days, you've talked about capital, talent, and regulation, and of course, those are absolutely the fundamental building blocks of high quality fintech hub. In addition, I think if we're looking at Islamic fintech, then I would say that a healthy, inquisitive culture is actually really key to ensuring that you're able to radically innovate new products. So this actually happened let's say about 15, 20 years ago, and it started in DIFC. And the reason, it's a shame Raja's not here actually, the reason why I think DIFC became the epicenter of the then Islamic finance revolution, a real boost to global growth rates, was because investment banks in London exported a number of people to DIFC, set them up there with all the financial infrastructure that they needed, and said, you have a clean slate, go away and develop as radical and wacky a product as you can come up with. Now, there's good and bad in that, of course. You know, there are, we at Deutsche Bank, we developed some, frankly, in retrospect, bizarre products, which should never have been developed. But the fact was that we were inquisitive. We were ready to create things from a fresh whiteboard, in a very egalitarian way. You know, we were not a hierarchical, stuffy, traditional. We operated as a very entrepreneurial team. And that culture of sort of scientific discovery and exploration, that was really important to building products that had never been built before. So I think to have a culture within a region or a center or a hub that encourages broad thinking, and we all talk about it. All the institutions talk about it. They all use words like innovation and thought leadership and whatever, but nobody really is. I mean, there's very, very few organizations that are actually innovative or have real thought leaders. This is a hackneyed phrase that we use all the time now for some strange reason, but very, very few of us actually deliver on that. And if you want to deliver on that, you have to give people the freedom to innovate. Let them loose. We were given 2 years at Deutsche Bank, 2 years without any P&L. We were let loose and said, create the most radically different things you've ever done before. You know, you have a clean slate, off you go. I'll give you all the resources, all the capital, all the infrastructure that you need. You need legal people, I get you legal people. You need compliance, I'll get you compliance. You need sign off from the top level exco at Deutsche Bank, I'll get you sign off, right? We were given that freedom. Now, I think if you work in an area or an organization that gives you that freedom to think, then I think that's where you start having the most interesting products coming out, and the ones that address specific problems.
I think I'll probably address this from a slightly different angle. You asked, what makes a hub a world-class hub? One of the most interesting things that we are now seeing is in the early days of fintech, when we were assessing different hubs in different jurisdictions on their capability, was everyone had this obsession to be number one, or how do we become number one? The dialogue has changed now. Everyone realizes that each jurisdiction is unique, has its own unique traits, and it's actually about collaboration. And Harris and I see this, from the UK perspective as well. We see a lot more interest from other OIC hubs in collaborating rather than just trying to, steal and copy what the UK has done well. I think each jurisdiction has its own unique problems. In terms of encouraging the innovation that Harris is talking about, I think it's unique to each area. So Malaysia will have its own unique problem, Indonesia its own, the Middle East countries their own, the UK has its own. What makes it, your question was what makes it world-class? I think what makes it world-class is when all of these things start to really come together in a perfect storm. I think the UK was very fortunate that a lot of these things existed organically and didn't need to be created. But one of the opportunities that exists for emerging hubs is to actually look at what's worked in other jurisdictions and really cherry pick the best. You don't have to make the same mistakes that have been made in other ecosystems that have wasted time and capital and resources. You can really choose the things that work and leapfrog. And I think the successful hubs are the ones that do that well. I always point to Malaysia. I think Malaysia has a really coordinated top-down approach in how to address that. I think all of the various entities within Malaysia that are focused on innovation, be it regulatory or government or NGO or innovators themselves, are fairly well aligned from what I can see externally on the innovation journey. Other jurisdictions, it seems to be some of it seems to be government-led and not a lot of substance in terms of actually what that ecosystem needs. And so when you have solutions emerging to the problems that you have in your ecosystem, There is no regulatory barriers to those emerging. It's actually actively encouraged. When you see people leaving corporate jobs to go towards more innovative jobs, when you see globally renowned startups targeting your jurisdiction as an expansion jurisdiction, I think those are the markers for me that signal that you are a world-class hub. And what I'm really encouraged with is more and more OIC hubs over the last 18 months, especially through COVID, fall into that category. I think the global innovation community is starting to twig as to the sort of potential of these jurisdictions. Again, what we discussed earlier was what's rather disappointing is internally within the Islamic world we seem less certain about this opportunity and less willing to act on this opportunity. And so those jurisdictions that will get it right, they will emerge and they will punch above their weight on the global stage, much like the UK does. And I squarely put Malaysia in that category. What's really interesting for me, especially from an Islamic fintech perspective, is what I would have called the sleeping giant, which is Saudi Arabia, is really starting to wake up. Fintech Saudi yesterday released their annual report. It's really encouraging to see all of the innovation that's happening, especially that's regulatory driven from a regulatory perspective, in terms of encouraging open banking, challenger banking, and all the other areas that are emerging in Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is a huge, sizable market in the Middle East that everyone wants to access. And so they are slightly late to the game, but I think they have they finally have a coordinated approach. I think they are seriously thinking about all of the building blocks of the ecosystem and putting them together. And their policies, like them or loathe them, I think are actually actually going to support their ecosystem. So, for example, the government putting in a stipulation that if you want to operate in Saudi Arabia, your regional headquarters need to be in Riyadh. It might seem draconian to some, but actually that's going to help drive innovation. That's going to bring talent into the region. And that's going to bring investment into the region. I think that's actually quite a smart move for Saudi Arabia. And so it's levers like this that policymakers and regulators need to be pulling that are unique to their jurisdiction. That's going to help them evolve. I think that time for we want to be number one and we're just going to copy what somebody else is doing, I think has passed, and it's now time to be authentic in each jurisdiction.
I do have a follow-up question to both you and Haris on that, but I'm going to try and do justice to the question. One of the questions that's come in, I think earlier on we did mention this in passing about Sharia compliance, the Sharia advisors and their role in this whole playbook. Different jurisdictions, different requirements. That's been talked about a lot. And mindful, there are also views now whether there is a need for Sharia pronouncements even for some of the products, especially in the fintech space. Where do you see that going? First question. And two, whether is that something that is slowing down the development? Just thoughts on that?
I think I'll
solutions to this.
Yeah, so I think Haris is better placed to answer this question, but I'll very quickly comment. What I see is a kind of a bifurcation of the Sharia compliance space. I think there are scholars that are from the old world of Islamic finance, and I think they have a protectionist attitude, which is to slap down anything that looks innovative and that perhaps they don't understand or is not quite fully understood generally by the industry. And I think there are those scholars who are actually on the side of innovation, who are as Haris described, curious, looking at things like digital assets, looking at things like AI and their application to the Islamic economy and Islamic finance generally, and trying to understand what are the parameters under which this can operate within the Islamic economy. And I think those that take that approach and that innovative approach of how can this operate within the Islamic economy, rather than saying, we don't understand this, this looks dodgy, let's shy away from it. I don't think that's the right attitude. I think the innovative attitude is the right attitude, because ultimately the Islamic world has an opportunity with technology to not be left behind anymore. And I think those that are embracing that technology and really trying to understand how does this fit within our Sharia framework, I think are the ones that are going to win out.
Yeah, it's interesting what you mentioned about whether one needs a pronouncement. I think one of the reasons why there is a growing trust gap in the UK between the traditional Islamic banks and their customer base is because they haven't engaged with them effectively. They haven't engaged with their customers effectively on the subject of Sharia. So they see that there's something different taking place at the legal level, but they're not quite sure. The customer's not quite sure what it is. And there are videos and explanatory pamphlets and booklets that are sent by these Islamic banks to explain why, for example, that home financing product is different from a conventional mortgage. But customers still feel that there's a bit of a trust gap. And I think community scholars can be very useful in re-establishing that trust gap. And that's something that fintech firms, certainly in the UK, have been doing very effectively. So I sit on the advisory board of a company called Primary Finance, which is a debt-free home financing company. And they've managed to raise money by traveling up and down the UK, visiting mosques, visiting Muslim communities, and encouraging them to think about how they finance their homes and how they could finance them in a better, purer, more Sharia compliant way. And that's been very surprisingly successful in a digital age when we use digital marketing and we use social media apps to put our message across. They've been physically meeting people up and down the country and raising so much money, which is, I think actually that's very encouraging in many ways. Does it slow down the rate of development to consider Sharia? Well, I mean, that's actually the point of good banking, isn't it? Once upon a time, a banker was meant to do due diligence and was meant to assess a company before he lent to that company. And today we have all kinds of weird and wonderful derivative type products that package up loans. The banker doesn't even know what's going on underneath them. And that's one of the contributing factors to the 2008 financial crisis, that we had these AAA, collateralized loans packaged up into financial instruments. And we didn't actually know what was underlying those, individual loans. So I think that the idea that Sharia would slow down the development of financial product development is possibly the wrong question to ask. Maybe the question we should be asking is, what does Sharia add to that process? How does it make that product better? And can we find Sharia scholars who are inquisitive enough, as Abdul was saying, who are willing to look at things beyond their traditional banking products? So they look at AI, they look at Bitcoin, they look at cryptocurrency, they look at lots of other areas that they haven't traditionally looked at before.
Okay. Maybe I'll try and let the last 5 minutes of the session be taken up by both yourself, Haris, and Hasib, in what has been done right that we should continue doing, and what needs to be done better, and what needs to be done, period.
Okay, go on.
What's been done right? I think what's been done right is that the first wave of innovation in Islamic fintech specifically is coming from outside of the banks. I think that is really needed. I don't think banks are the innovation engine within finance at the moment, within Islamic finance at least. What can be done better? Actually, one of the areas we look at for building a global Islamic ecosystem is how well are the banks participating. And banks have a playbook that they use. There's sort of 8 things that they can do to participate in innovation that we've seen both on the conventional and the Islamic fintech side. And for each bank, it's different. It's not a cookie cutter approach. They have to take a view as to which of those measures work for them, and they need to test what works and what doesn't work, and iterate from there. Much like good innovators do anyway. I think that there's some banks in Malaysia and the Middle East that are actually very good at that, but globally the Islamic banking sector is fairly weak on that, and I think that's something we need to do better. And your final question, I forget the phrasing you use. Is it what else needs to happen?
Yeah, what needs to happen?
I think what else needs to happen is really the pain points that we talked about at the beginning of this session. So you know, access to capital. I think that's a problem that's not going away, and it is a hurdle. It becomes a hurdle after a while, and we are seeing that in the UK. And I think if it's not adequately addressed in other jurisdictions, there will come a point where it becomes a barrier as well. I think at the moment, some of the other jurisdictions which are slightly earlier stage haven't experienced it to the degree we've experienced it in the UK. I think that has to change. What is changing and what's really encouraging is the sort of the regulatory approach to Islamic fintech. Fintech generally, and again, as we described, Islamic fintech as a subset of that. You know, no longer looking at fintech as you know, a potential threat or damaging to consumers, but actually looking at it as the next wave of innovation within Islamic finance and within finance generally that we're seeing from regulators in OIC countries, I think is hugely encouraging. And the final thing I think that needs to happen on that front is collaboration between regulators. So actually regulators learning from others, what's worked well, what's not worked well. It's great to see that you know, within the global regulatory innovation network called GFIN, there's a number of OIC regulators in that ecosystem from the very beginning, looking at what other more established jurisdictions are doing and learning from that. I think you know, when we talk about Sharia compliance, then I think there needs to be a bit of coordination between OIC countries on you know, how regulation can work in the innovation space across OIC countries. I think that may become another challenge where if we don't coordinate, you know, fintechs can't move from jurisdiction to jurisdiction because of the regulatory overhead that brings. So that's one area that we need to keep an eye on as this ecosystem develops.
Okay.
I think I would add one more thing, and that is Islamic financial institutions, the banks particularly, still hold the financial power in this space, and so you know, we can't pretend that, you know, they will become completely redundant. I mean, clearly they still hold that power. So if they don't react quickly, then I think that the international investment banks will step in and will steal that market share from them, just as happened 15, 20 years ago. So I think it's incumbent on them to recognize that this area is a massive growth area, and they need to, rather than pay lip service to it and say, oh yes, you know, digital is very important to us, you know, we have a new digital app, actually to look fundamentally at the small companies who are doing radically new types of financial products, examine what they're doing and the culture that they have, and see if they can do that as well, because they, as I say, they hold the power and they potentially have the ability to fund these smaller companies.
This conversation deserves a lot of follow-up questions for sure, Haris and Hasib, and definitely deserving of another round. But unfortunately, I think I'm told we have to wind up. So I think I've also tried to cover one of the questions that came in, paraphrase the others that's come in. So hopefully that would have met some of the curiosity out there. I think some of the keywords that came out of this: collaboration, awareness, the continued efforts to just enable and facilitate by regulators, the conversations. Definitely a lot more that we can talk about. I like to follow up with you, Haris, on the freedom of ideation, because I think you brought up a very interesting point, which I constantly talk about even in my day-to-day, which is the P&L, is the balancing of the P&L and wanting to ideate, giving the freedom, realizing everything has a gestation, but we all want things happening yesterday, right? So obviously there's always that tricky situation we're in, but let's hope for more sessions. Maybe SC and SC can arrange. I know SC Islamic Capital Markets will definitely be reaching out to both of you for some of the ideas that we're having post our Capital Market Master Plan 3. I want to thank again both of you for your wonderful insights and views on what makes a world-class Islamic FinTech hub. And God willing, inshallah, we will see in the next conversation some of the aspirations we have talked about here attain as we go through this journey together. Until then, thank you everyone. Take care, stay safe, and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.